After the Norman conquest of 1066, there were three languages on the island. There was the Norman dialect of French, or Old French. That was the language of the court and the aristocracy. Old English was the language of the conquered, which was the majority of the people there. And Latin continued as the language of the church and of much writing, especially writing that circulated on the continent. So what happened in the 1100s? The most significant event would have been the murder of St. Thomas à Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his own cathedral. Eventually, he was determined to be a saint, a shrine was built to him, and pilgrimages were started to Canterbury Cathedral. You may also have heard of the famous episode of Richard the Lionhearted being held for ransom in Austria. This was the subject that shows up in many Robin Hood movies in the present day. That took place in this time period too. Writers of the Anglo-Norman period, a lot of our historical, well, quasi-historical material comes from Geoffrey of Monmouth. He was born in Wales, but he came from a Breton family that had come over with the conqueror. That was always an indicator that you were actually Norman and therefore of a higher social class than all of those old English speakers milling around in town. He wrote a history of the kings of England, which was theoretically history, although the source material is a little dubious at times. What is in this history? Well, it's fairly imaginative, although it is based on these sources. One of the sources gives us an origin story for Britannia, or Albion, as it was called back then. It turns out that the great-grandson of the famous Trojan Aeneas, who went on to found Rome after the fall of Troy, was actually the founder of England. So Brutus, or Felix Brutus, as he is more fully called, is the greatest ancestor in England. What you also get out of Geoffrey of Monmouth is material about King Arthur, stories about Merlin, and actually where the plot of King Lear comes from by Shakespeare. Turns out it has some kind of source material too. He stops with the departure of the Britons for Brittany, and then the arrival of the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes get picked up by other historians. Who are the other writers of the Anglo-Norman period? Well, Marie de France, originally from France, as her name suggests, had very aristocratic connections at the English court, well known for writing her lays or short romances. She also did translations of Aesop's fables, supposedly from English into French. And there are actually a lot of manuscripts of this. This apparently was very popular. And we actually have a beautiful illustration, fairly contemporary, of her writing one of her works. The lays were written in French, and they were adaptations of stories that she had heard from Breton people, perhaps minstrels. The form she used was an 8-syllable rhymed couplet. She's actually counting syllables, so the rhythm is sort of dee-dum, 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 and they rhyme in couplets A, A, B, B, C, C. The features that come out of these Breton stories are actually quite novel. This is where magic comes from, fairies, an attention to love. The stories of the Arthurian knights come out of these stories, and sometimes you get all of these features in a single story. I've dropped a little map in here to remind you where Brittany is in relation to Normandy and England. And I've also got a beautiful manuscript illustration of one of her lays, which you can see observes line endings, so it writes out poetry as if it actually were poetry. What's happening to the language? Well, it's evolving, as it's been doing for some time. The speakers of Old English have been absorbing the vocabulary and the pronunciation from the French speakers, which leads to a new version of English, which we now in hindsight refer to as Middle English, though that covers quite a large range of language development. Everyone, except perhaps those at the highest levels of society, tend to understand Middle English. French, of course, is still around. It's spoken at the law courts, it's spoken at the royal court, and Latin is still around, of course. It's the official language of the church, and it's also the language in which all instruction is taking place at the newly founded universities in Oxford and at Cambridge. What's happening in the 1200s? Well, the loss of Normandy by King John pretty much cuts the cord between England and the continent. And then we have the signing of the Magna Carta by King John, which ends up being very significant for 19th and 20th century politics, in fact. And in 1282, Wales becomes an English colony under Edward I, making it possible now for the eldest son of the monarch to be styled the Prince of Wales. Writing in early versions of Middle English, we have Layamon's version of the story of Felix Brutus. We have the cuckoo songs, Summer is a comin in, Lludd sing cuckoo, which we have actually music for as well, as you can see here. And as a representative romance, we have Sir Orfeo. It's in the Norton Anthology. I never assign it, but it's really a delightful work. It's well worth reading. Two big events in the 1300s. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England during the reign of Edward III. This had removed about 40% of the population of Europe over the span of 3 or 4 years. It was one of the really big global pandemics. Then in 1399, Henry Bolingbroke deposes Richard II, the king, who was also his cousin, and appoints and styles himself Henry IV. Shakespeare wrote 2 plays on the subject, Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2. What's distinctive here is that Henry is the first king of England whose mother tongue is English and not French. As a result, English finally displaces French as the official language of the royal court. This actually had already happened in the law courts about 30 years earlier, and this will be very, very lucky for Geoffrey Chaucer, who is related in a way by marriage to Henry Bolingbroke, and it's going to be rather good for him to be an English writing poet in the right place at the right time. What writing do we have in the later Middle English dialect? Well, there's Langland's Piers Plowman, a long, complex, allegorical dream vision involving a state satire that was really quite well known in the time period. We have the anonymous romance, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that everyone knows quite well. We also have religious writing, of course. Julian of Norwich, who lived as a hermit in England, wrote down her mystical visions in the Book of Showings and was quite inspirational on later religious writers. And at the same time, we also have secular writing by Geoffrey Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales being probably the most famous thing that he wrote, although he wrote quite a lot of other things and in other languages. Events of this time period. We've got the Battle of Agincourt, significant because England finally wins back some of its continental territory, and it's also important psychologically for the English. Shakespeare wrote a play about this. 1455 to 85, we've got the War of the Roses, in which 2 branches of the royal family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, try to duke it out with each other as to who is going to control the throne. Shakespeare wrote a whole series of plays about this as well. In 1475, Caxton prints the first book in England. Printing has been developed on the continent maybe about 20 years before that, and it's just taken off like wildfire. 1485 ends the War of the Roses with Henry Tudor defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He styles himself Henry VII. He marries, he's a Lancastrian, he marries Elizabeth of the House of York, and he founds a new dynasty known as the Tudors. The early modern age is in sight. I've given you an illustration here of the first book printed in England by Caxton. Literature of this century, we have the Book of Margery Kempe. A middle-class woman met Julian of Norwich. She was quite inspired by her mystical visions and devoutness and wrote a book as well. In fact, this is the first autobiography in English. On 1470, we have Sir Thomas Malory's version of the Arthur story called The Morte d'Arthur. It has a French title, but the work is actually in English. I've given you actually a little illustration here of Caxton's printing of The Morte d'Arthur. A lot of the versions of the Arthur stories that we know actually come from Malory's version. It was very, very well known, especially after Caxton printed it. And in 1500, we get the play Everyman, which represents a strain of drama known as morality drama. There had been earlier forms of drama, mystery plays, which are stories of the Bible done as stage works, and the lives of the saints done as drama. But everyman is sort of the beginning of kind of independent theater. That'll be a while before we get to something we'll recognize as modern theater. So the English language has been evolving rapidly through this whole time, but the arrival of printing in 1475 in London slows things down dramatically. And it also establishes the London dialect, our printers, after all, were from London, as the norm. And once books are printed in London in the London dialect and circulated throughout the island, it starts standardizing on that particular dialect. And it also slows down the evolution of the language. So early modern English has arrived.